protection brother.
This week, the National Shipper Advisory Committee of the Federal Maritime Commission met, and it got me thinking about this newer Federal Advisory Committee. Do you know what a Federal Advisory Committee is and how they are run or how they're supposed to be run? Specifically, do you know much about this National Shipper Advisory Committee? We're going to talk about it today. Let's dive in. Hi, welcome to By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Began, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video or this podcast. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But before we get into the discussion of the day, let's go through my top 3 stories of the week. All right, so story number 1. Looks like the U.S. government isn't going to shut down tonight. Yay! I feel like a broken record, right? Look, they pushed off the deadline again. Now it's through a continuing resolution. But it looks like this one's a little bit funny. It looks like different agencies are funded to different dates, as I understand it. For example, it looks like the Department of Transportation is funded through January 19th. So what does this mean? We may have just kicked the can down the road, especially if different agencies are going to be different dates. That almost makes it more likely, not that the entire government will shut down, but that maybe these tranches of agency groupings might have a higher probability that we will see that kind of agency grouping shut down. I'm not sure. Look, today's the deadline. I believe the president is going to sign it, has signed it. The Senate passed it, House and Senate passed it, so it's kind of a done deal. And I think we're going to learn more over the next week or two. Right, next week is Thanksgiving. So as we learn more about what exactly is in this extension of funding through at least January in one regard, we'll see what's happening here. But for now, I've heard it said a few different times, nobody wants to be the Grinch for Christmas. So Congress is not the Grinch, at least in this regard this year. All right, story number 2. We still have 3 rulemakings that we're watching from the Federal Maritime Commission and 1 request for information and potentially a second RFI in the next few weeks, I keep hearing. So what are we? Let's kind of take a overview of what's going on here. We do it pretty much every week, but I'm still waiting on a lot of the final language to come out, so I want to keep it top of mind. So the 3 rules that we're watching, we have defining unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations provided by an ocean common carrier. Giant name. I think I can repeat it in my sleep these days. But essentially, we've talked about this one before. This is the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate. Initially, it was all about the exporters. The FMC expanded this to be about importers as well, and kind of a general approach to defining unreasonable refusal to deal for the vessel space accommodations. We've seen some language come out of this. We've seen a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking come out of this one. The commission said at the last briefing, at their last meeting, that they're reviewing comments and drafting a proposed final rule for this. So we had the initial notice of proposed rulemaking on the unreasonable refusal. That came out. Chairman Maffei said, this is a tricky one. We want to get it right. Opened comments back up and had a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking, kind of a second round of comments, notice and comment. That closed up over the summer. That was July 31st that closed. Now they're still reviewing those comments. So that one, remember this one? We've highlighted a few. I think this was the last one we highlighted before I broke for the summer. I want you to take a look at this because this is defining unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate. One of the definitions is unreasonable reasonableness. And I'm cautious here because it really is a definition of the word reasonableness or the concept of reasonableness, unreasonableness. And I'm a little cautious that they haven't narrowly tailored it to the refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations, and that there might be an unintended consequence of that reasonableness being expanded into other areas of FMC jurisdictional authority. Take a look at it. All that to say, take a look at it yourself. Comments have closed on this, but usually there's one last small little sliver bite at the apple when a final rule comes out that any significantly adverse comments will have to be addressed and can potentially stop the effective date or the implementation date of a final rule. It's a pretty high threshold to get over for that, but still could happen. I want you to take a look at this. I agree with Chairman Maffei that this one is a little bit tricky and that they want to get it right. And so I encourage you to stay engaged with this one, even though it's maybe a little bit less popular than the detention and demurrage billing requirements. So that's the other one, right? That's the second big rulemaking that we're watching is the billing practices of detention and demurrage. At last check-in with the FMC at their meeting, they said that they were still reviewing comments. They said they had some substantive comments come in. At that time, they'd said within the last month, so that was in September. Early September, they did have a comment come in from two congressmen, and those two congressmen sat on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. So that is the committee that funds the FMC, essentially, or it kind of has direct authority over the FMC. Recently, there was a follow-up announcement in the docket, the regulations.gov docket, for the D&D rulemaking, where it said that there was an ex parte communication. And so what that is basically the commissioners went and chatted with the congressman. It doesn't say much, but it does say that they went and they chatted. They addressed the issues that the congressman raised. So that surrounded marine terminal operators. They took issue with the incentive principle and the Evergreen case that the FMC has kind of been, almost advertising. They put it out on a news and press release saying that this informal docket, the Evergreen case, was saying that, and it was almost, it was a generalized, potentially even broadening, and look, read it for yourself, right? But basically what that case says, that the FMC says in their press release, was that any cargo that was held over the weekend is contrary to the incentive principle and should not be charged. Detention demurrage should not be charged during that time. Take a look. That is paraphrasing. Again, this is not legal advice. I want you to take a look at what that says. But that's kind of what they're saying. That's what they've said, that the FMC has said in a press release. So congressmen are saying, we disagree with that. We disagree. We think that holidays and weekends should have detention demurrage assessed because it further incentivizes people to get their stuff out of the yard before it closes for that holiday or that weekend, where they will be inevitably receiving the 2 or 3 or however long the holiday or weekend is, extra days of charges for that space use. To be a fly on the wall in that conversation, right? That would have been a really interesting conversation. I wish that there would have been more of a readout from that ex parte kind of announcement. I expect that the final rule will directly address the concerns. We talked about the comment that the congressman had made, 2 or 3 weeks ago? Take a look at it yourself. It's in the docket of the detention demurrage. There's 188 comments, I believe, now that have been filed, because there were even some responsive comments to the congressman's comments in the docket. So take a look. I'm hoping we get the final language pretty soon. I think that this congressional involvement through the comment submission will likely slow it down. It already has, right? Are we going to be getting a final rule language before the end of the year? I don't know, right? It's November 17th. I hope so. I hope so, because these comments closed last year, December 13th, and here we are still waiting. This was supposed to be concluded within 1 year of OSRA's passage, which was June 16th over the summer. But again, they want to get it right. They want to make sure that they are making positive change in the industry. And the FMC kind of keeps saying they want to make sure that they have appropriate guardrails in place. Take a look at this one. It's still moving, right? The comments have already been submitted, but they're clearly still taking comments late filed. Not just the congressional submission, but the responses to the congressional submission. This is a very active docket, despite not being open for comment right now. And the third rule that we're watching to kind of conclude it is the unfair, unjustly discriminatory methods in the context of 41103, resorting to unfair, unjustly discriminatory methods. FMC said in their last meeting that this was partially addressed in the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking for the unreasonable refusal of cargo space, because, again, this is unfair, unjustly discriminatory methods, which arguably kind of hinges on that unreasonable refusal of cargo space. But the general counsel at the time said that they were finalizing the proposed rule with the remaining sections of this rule as required under OSRA for the commission's consideration and vote. So we'll get language. It sounds almost inevitable that we will be getting language on the unfair, unjustly discriminatory methods, but it's clear that this one has been bumped below the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate and the detention demurrage rulemakings. We've talked at length about this, but the MTDI, the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative, the request for information just concluded for that. It looks like they are still receiving comments. Most of the comments were received after the close of the comment period. So there's some pretty interesting comments going through there. Take a look at those. I've also heard that there might be a second RFI put out with respect to the MTDI. So this one, again, remember, this was kind of talking about the stakeholder-specific questions and responses to the report, the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative's overall report. It sounds like there might be kind of another angle of questions submitted or questions presented by the Federal Maritime Commission, trying to get more engagement and more feedback on that report from maybe a different angle. So look, stay tuned to By Land and By Sea. I'm going to keep watching, obviously, all of these rulemakings and let you know what develops here. And I'm also going to keep watching the MTDI. I just love the conversation that the MTDI is creating within the industry and this attention to data and data submissions and data transactions and just data as it relates to the industry and perhaps the digitization of the data. So this is interesting. I'll keep watching it. So story number 3, we're back to the Panama Canal. I keep bringing it up not to freak anybody out, not to heighten the severity of what's going on, but just to keep you informed because, as I keep saying, it's not a major problem, but it's something to watch. So I still think that we're in a fine position, but I think that it is getting closer to having an impact on containerized cargo movement. I've been noticing people paying a little bit closer attention to the Panama Canal. Remember, so what's happening in the Panama Canal? We started talking about this in the spring. We started kind of casually tracking it, just mentioning that it was something to watch. Over the summer, we started to see mainstream media take an interest in it, talking about some of the large vessel queues that were happening. But still, even the trade press, the specific trade press was saying it's something to watch, but it's nothing major yet. The impact really is still on those heavy vessels. And so that is bulk cargo, that is liquid cargo, that is LNG, that's crude oil, that's any of that stuff that's not necessarily containerized cargo. And so where we are right now is it's a 44-foot draft that is being allowed through. And so that is, most containerized cargo are pretty okay to traverse the area for that. But just this week, we had a report come out that one ship owner paid a record $4 million to skip the line and head through the Panama Canal. And I believe that was an LNG tanker. It was a liquid tanker of some sort. Paid $4 million to skip the line. Apparently there's an auction that the Panama Canal puts out, and they auction to skip the line there. So as I understand it, right, money to the Panama Canal. So this might end up being something that a surcharge, right, that the Panama Canal kind of in turn is collecting. I don't know. This is a new thing, this $4 million. So why I wanted to bring the Panama Canal up again, though, is that they're going to be reducing vessel activity. So on a good day, typical vessel activity at the Panama Canal is about 36 vessels going through. By February 1st, the Panama Canal Authority has given out notice that they are going to be reducing that down to 18 vessels a day. So that's something to watch because that has nothing to do with the draft of any of the vessels, but that has to do with number of vessels going through. And so while even when there are vessel queues, vessel lineups, the containerized cargo still has preference to go through the Panama Canal But if you're limiting it down to 18, it's inevitably going to come close, if not will impact the containerized cargo movement, especially if some of these larger vessels, heavier vessels, are paying a premium to skip the line. So look, the drought has plagued the area, and it's making it difficult for the lakes to support the canal, right? So as you may know, it's a lock system. So the lakes provide the water that fill it up or empty out the individual locks as the vessel moves through the different compartments of the Panama Canal. If you've never watched a video on how locks work, I encourage you to do so. It's pretty interesting. Everything will kind of make sense on what's happening with the draft. So that's the vessel water displacement, how low into the water the vessel sits. Obviously, most people who are listening here probably are pretty familiar with vessels. But yeah, so that would be something to go take a look at, see how locks work, and then start to understand that in the Panama Canal perspective. Again, not something to freak out about quite yet, but I just keep bringing it up as there's new information. This is something with the 18 vessels going through. I guess my next question would be, how many of those 18 or how many of those 36 on a regular good day are containerized cargo vessels, and how many are these LNG or heavier bulk carriers? I don't know. And so that will really be the question of how soon the impact will potentially hit the containerized cargo. But anyways, we'll keep an eye on it. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of the day. Today we're talking about FACAs, Federal Advisory Committees under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So about a year ago, we did an overview of FACAs, but we did it kind of from the perspective of MTSNAC. So that's the Maritime Transportation System National Advisory Committee. That's hosted by the Department of Transportation through the Maritime Administration. But this week, the Federal Maritime Commission's FACA met. So that's the National Shipper Advisory Committee. So I thought it might be a good time to kind of review what FACAs are. Like I said, it's been about a year. And let's talk about them from the lens of the National Shipper Advisory Committee, what they can, what they can't do, and quickly maybe hit some of the notable things from this week's National Shipper Advisory Committee. So GSA, the General Services Agency Authority of the United States, is responsible for kind of the administration of FACAs. So advisory committees, from their website, advisory committees have played an important role in shaping programs and policies of the federal government from the earliest days of the Republic, which I guess I didn't really realize, but of course, right? They said President George Washington at the time sought the advice of such a committee during the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. It likely wasn't called a FACA, right? But it likely was kind of the idea of crowdsourcing. And that's essentially what the Federal Advisory Committee is particular crowdsourcing from a group of trusted advisors, but doing so in a way that has a open public element to it. So today there's an average of 1,000 advisory committees with over 60,000 members that essentially advise the president or the executive branch, or really any federal agency that has one of these federal advisory committees. Now, through the enactment of FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act of 1972, U.S. Congress formally recognized the merits of seeking the advice and assistance of kind of stakeholders in the industry. And again, this is all part of the GSA's website that I'm pulling this information from. So Congress sought to assure that advisory committees do kind of three things: provide advice that is relevant, objective, and open to the public, act promptly to complete their work, and three, comply with reasonable cost controls and record-keeping requirements. And so that's what they wanted to create some structure around advisory committees. Essentially, the role of a federal advisory committee is, with the expertise from advisory committee members, federal officials, and therefore kind of the entire nation, have access to information and advice on a broad range of issues affecting federal programs and policies. The public, in return, is afforded an opportunity to provide direct input into a process that may form the basis for government decisions. So it's not necessarily, it's kind of outside of the world of lobbying, right? It's the government has asked for a group to form. They've provided kind of the structure for that group to form. And these advisory committee members then are able to provide their input into whatever the topic of that advisory committee is. So each federal agency that does sponsor these advisory committees really must adhere to requirements established under the FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And that is under the General Services Administration. So that's the GSA, an agency under the under the United States. The GSA's had the responsibility for overseeing the FACA since 1977. And again, like I said, the FACA Act as it is now is from 1972. So advisory committee meetings also fall under the Sunshine Act. And so basically, if you've ever heard of the Sunshine Act, it kind of makes it so that things that happen in federal agencies don't happen in the dark, as the name suggests. They happen in the sunshine. They happen in the light. So there's a presumption of advisory committees or even federal agency activity, especially for the political appointees, happening in the light. So there's a presumption that that would be open. And so then it can only be closed under certain circumstances. So under advisory committees, these meetings may only be closed or partially closed to the public based upon provisions of the Sunshine Act. And there's a few examples of those that the GSA gives. For the most part, these circle around when discussions start to hinge on classified information, when there's a review of proprietary data submitted in support of federal grant applications, or really kind of proprietary data, or deliberations involving considerations of personnel privacy. So really kind of when you start to hit on some of those private matters, right? So proprietary data, I can imagine that probably IP business practices, anything that you really kind of otherwise doesn't have that public element or public benefit, or that might harm the businesses involved from their open discussions. But FACAs, Federal Advisory Committees, aren't always required. And so when I say FACAs, the acronym actually is Federal Advisory Committee Act. But when you talk about Federal Advisory Committees, generally, you really just call them FACAs. So FACAs aren't always required, and under GSA's guidance policies, they actually illustrate when FACAs aren't required, right? Because they have all these rules around, or they have all this guidance around FACAs and what can and can't happen, and they have to be public meetings, and they have to be published and noticed in the Federal Register so that people know when they're about to meet. But not everything has to be a FACA. And so the factual assumption or the factual hypothetical that the GSA puts down is that when an administrator wishes a series of meetings with senior corporate executives from companies which are faced or facing challenges similar to those facing government today, downsizing, restructuring, reduced resources, creative financing needs, labor and human resource concerns, increased customer relations demands, this is a hypothetical of when a FACA is not required. What this GSA hypothetical says is that the administrator will obtain experiential and anecdotal information from each executive on challenges faced by their company, how the company met the challenges, approaches which were productive and successful, and those which were not. The specific agenda subjects will likely change and may be set in advance or be a free form. No collective advice or recommendations will be solicited. So this GSA hypothetical says FACAs don't apply here because the purpose is to obtain information or viewpoints from individual attendees as opposed to advice, opinions, and recommendations from the group acting in a collective mode. What I take from this is that ad hoc nature. So when there's really truly an ad hoc, we just need a little bit of advice, you don't have to create a formal FACA with a charter and all of these regulated formal things just to get a little advice from stakeholders. That's, I think, what this is really saying. So that's different than some of the FACAs that we've talked about before, certainly from MITSNAC and from the National Shipper Advisory Committee. These advisory committees are established for the ongoing conversation. They want expertise, insight, and recommendations from these advisory committees from a kind of topic that isn't this ad hoc, in the moment, quick discussion. They want something that can still have some free form to it, but that is a long-term continuing conversation. So let's turn now to the National Shipper Advisory Committee, the specific National Shipper Advisory Committee from the Federal Maritime Commission. So it's a federal advisory committee, just as we've been describing here. It's a FACA. The committee is challenged to provide information, insight, and expertise pertaining to conditions in the ocean freight delivery system to the commission. Makes sense, right? And it's from the shipper's perspective, because that's what the name suggests, the National Shipper Advisory Committee. The committee is advising the commission on policies relating to the competitiveness, reliability, integrity, and fairness of the international ocean freight delivery system. Makes sense, because those are the mission and the vision and the core of what the Federal Maritime Commission is chartered to do, or is statutory authority to do. to review competitiveness, reliability, integrity, and fairness. So the membership is actually 12 representatives of entities who export cargo and 12 representatives of entities who import cargo. So there's 24 overall shippers on this Federal Advisory Committee. And they have a charter, and they have the federal, they operate under the provisions of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So we've previously chatted about a few of the things that the National Shipper Advisory Committee have been working on. But like I said, I wanted to kind of take a minute, go over FACAs generally so that you know that there really are some specific requirements that all FACAs have. When we talked about this a year ago, I suggested if you're interested in an area that you know there's a Federal Advisory Committee, go open up the Federal Register, go on the website, do a search of the Federal Advisory Committee, and you can find out when they will be publicly meeting next. And for the most part, you're able to join. And often there's a virtual link so that you can join, so you can listen in. You can see what some of these advisory committees are doing. That is no different than MITSNAC, and that's no different than the National Shipper Advisory Committee. Oftentimes you have to maybe perhaps register in advance so that they can send you the link to whatever it is. But there's a public element to it. That's what we covered about a year ago. So today I wanted to cover some of the basic 101. We've talked about what NSAC, National Shipper Advisory Committee, has been working on. Specifically, they routinely submit recommendations to the FMC, and then the FMC responds to that. So there's some pretty interesting information and pretty interesting exchange coming from the shippers, from the Shipper Advisory Committee, and the FMC. So, for example, in May of 2023, there was a recommendation submitted by the National Shipper Advisory Committee to the Federal Maritime Commission recommending changes to detention demurrage final rule language. So we talked about that detention demurrage billing requirements rule at the outset of today's show. They actually submitted their comments through their National Shipper Advisory Committee recommendation method, I guess. Specifically, in that recommendation, the National Shipper Advisory Committee drew attention to the fact that it was somewhat of a gray area for rail storage charges to fall under FMC statutory authority. We've talked about that a bunch. That's kind of something that I think is still percolating, and I expect will be addressed in probably the next 6 months to a year. I think that that's something that it seems the industry is asking for more clarity on. Not only from a 77 shipper letter that was sent to Congress last May, but that was also around the same time that the National Shipper Advisory Committee was submitting the recommendation to the FMC saying, look, we're identifying that there's a gray area for rail storage charges and whether or not it falls under FMC statutory authority. They received some assurances from the FMC that through bills of lading are considered under FMC authority. But that doesn't explicitly identify rail storage charges. The FMC consistently says through bills of lading, but it's a little less clear to find rail storage charges specifically falling there. I mean, it falls within reason, but that's kind of what's being asserted here. So the National Shipper Advisory Committee recommended that the FMC expand the definition of detention demurrage in this May recommendation to mean any charges, including per diem assessments, by, and what they want to add is, or on behalf of ocean common carriers, and then accordingly they wanted to also eliminate the word marine from this clause being related to terminal space. So what it says is marine terminal space. What the National Shipper Advisory Committee is recommending is remove marine, because that might create questions surrounding whether rail charges under a through bill would count, right? Marine terminal space makes it seem like rail charges are probably not included. So this has been actually great to watch because the FMC did respond, and they said that, okay, thank you for your comment. You know, we really appreciate it. And then they went ahead and placed that recommendation under the comments section of the D&D billing practices docket, the rulemaking, which was probably the appropriate response and action by the agency. They couldn't say, yes, you're right, we're going to be doing all these things right now, because then that would be removing it from the rulemaking process and creating this kind of ex parte interaction. But they moved it over. They said, thank you very much. You know, this is the method that we have set up for federal advisory committees to engage with the Federal Maritime Commission. Thank you for your recommendation. This will be appropriately scooted over to the docket for the rulemaking. they couldn't have like a secret side meeting, right? They had to be putting it over into the light. So the recommendation from the FACA was appropriate, right? Likely brought more attention to their specific recommendation because they presented it under the National Shipper Advisory Committee, saying this gray area of rail storage charges. But then it was also appropriately routed by the Federal Maritime Commission over to the rulemaking docket. I think that was also appropriate. So that's kind of how it tends to work. And if you're interested in learning more, there is a website for the National Shipper Advisory Committee. You can find out more about the meetings that they've had in the past. You can actually go to the YouTube page for the Federal Maritime Commission, see some of those previous National Shipper Advisory Committee meetings. Usually there's some sort of a presentation. There were presentations this week for the National Shipper Advisory Committee. There were presentations in previous National Shipper Advisory Committees. From my experience with federal advisory committees, there are usually presentations because they want to learn more on specific topics. This week they were fairly data driven for the National Shipper Advisory Committee. So there were actually two different areas that I kind of want to put on your radar. Little things that came out from the National Shipper Advisory Committee meeting this week. Just something that I took note of that they were talking about and something that I'm going to be paying more attention to. So they mentioned that Congressman Garamendi of California was interested in potentially creating a bill that would clarify the Surface Transportation Board and the Federal Maritime Commission's jurisdiction over these rail storage charges. And it wasn't clear if the bill would actually clarify or if the bill would require the FMC and the STB to, what was said is that perhaps there'd be a memorandum of understanding required so that the FMC and the STB would kind of more clearly identify the delineation, the separation, the who has what in this area, which would in turn create that clarity. There's questions, right? There's clearly questions over rail storage fees, and it seems like there is an association. There isn't the industry doesn't seem to be satisfied by the seeming clarity that's being told to them is out there, right, for these through bills of lading. So I think that this is something that, I keep saying it, I think this is something that we should pay attention to. I think this is something that we might see more clarity on. And perhaps it'll be through Congressman Garamendi's bill here. And I haven't seen any draft language. I haven't seen any announcements about this. This was just casually brought up with the National Shipper Advisory Committee meeting this week. Something to pay attention to. The other issue that came up that I thought was kind of interesting is that the National Shipper Advisory Committee said that from previous discussions with the Surface Transportation Board, STB actually gave 3 distinct legal reasons why they are not the agency with authority over the rail storage charges. They gave 2 different statutes, which they didn't recount in the meeting yesterday, but they did mention the Stagers Act. So the Stagers Rail Act of 1980 was implemented by the Interstate Commerce Commission at the time, now the Surface Transportation Board. So there's a white paper out there that was put out by the Office of Policy of the Federal Railroad Administration in March 2011 about kind of the implementation and the effects of the Stagers Act of 1980. Essentially what happened with the Stagers Act was it was a deregulation over the railroad industry. So many regulatory restraints on the railroad industry were removed, providing the industry increased flexibility. This is what the white paper was saying, increased flexibility to adjust their rates and tailor services to meet shipper needs and their own revenue requirements. The paper goes on to say, as a result, 30 years after deregulation, the railroads industry's financial health has improved significantly, service to rail customers has improved while overall rates have decreased, and rail safety, regardless of the measure, has improved. So this was a snapshot provided by the Office of Policy of the Federal Railroad Administration in March of 2011. They continue to say the Stagers Rail Act of 1980 limited the authority of the STB to regulate rates only for traffic where competition is not effective to protect shippers. So they were limiting this to where they were only regulating rates where competition was not effective to protect shippers. So they were kind of, instead of being proactive, they were being reactive a little bit and saying, well, we'll come in when there's a problem. The paper also says the STB estimates that roughly 20% of traffic is still regulated. Approximately half of all traffic on a revenue basis is exempt from regulation. This was from 2011. The Stagers Act, the paper continues, legalized railroad shipper contracts, and these contracts represent privately negotiated agreements between railroads and shippers over rates, service levels, equipment, and minimum annual volume of traffic, just to name a few. So what I want you to take from this whole Stagers Act thing is that railroads were deregulated at the time. And so it kind of makes sense that the STB, and certainly that's what they said, doesn't have authority over the rail storage charges, because instead of having authority unless otherwise exempted, it seems like the Stagers Act really said this is going to be more competition based, and the STB will only come in when there's a problem. So instead of the all with the exceptions, it is the all is kind of unregulated with the exceptions of a few guardrails of the industry. So I think that this one, I just keep seeing people talking about it. I think that this is going to come around in the next 6 months to a year, maybe even longer than that, because there's a lot going on, right? But I think the rail storage charges will become more of a issue that the community, that the supply chain ecosystem talks about more. The National Shipper Advisory Committee also had a quick little comment, a quick little thought that I think they're going to continue to look into, but it had to do with MTOs, marine terminal operators, and excess dwell fees. And they were kind of talking about the reasonableness now that the days of COVID congestion have kind of mostly passed, right? So these excess dwell fees was something that a lot of ports terminals were implementing during COVID to try and eliminate BCOs and shippers leaving their cargo on the yard or terminal because the warehouses were just too full to take it. Really, it was getting at the longest lingering goods is what they were trying to take aim at. But it would stand to reason that perhaps now this is not necessary, and perhaps could be eliminated before it becomes just an unnecessary charge. That's kind of what they were starting to talk about with the National Shipper Advisory Committee discussion yesterday. It seems like NSAC, the National Shipper Advisory Committee, is going to start reviewing this concept. Perhaps these long-dwelling cargo, maybe they've always been a problem and it was exacerbated during COVID congestion, and that's what NSAC will find, is that maybe they still serve a purpose, these long dwell fees. I don't know. This is going to be something that I'm going to pay attention to with National Shipper Advisory Committee as they look into it. Perhaps they'll come up with a recommendation on this. Perhaps they'll just have some more meetings. Maybe there's going to be a presentation or two from an MTO or a port that has implemented these excess dwell fees. But I thought that was interesting, because now that we're kind of post-COVID, post-congestion, because it wasn't just COVID, right? But post this congestion period, it's going to be interesting to see if what is identified as something requiring repeal or pulling back of some of those things that were put in place to try to solve these problems. So I'm going to be paying attention to it. You know, sometimes I just kind of want to say this. Sometimes FACAs, Federal Advisory Committees, do get a bad rap for being not that effective or even sometimes sleepy. But at least in the maritime world, it seems like these Federal Advisory Committees are kind of hitting the ground running. They really are putting out recommendations. The agencies are listening to them. The Federal Maritime Commission stays very engaged with the National Shipper Advisory Committee, which I love to see, because really they're there to aid the agency, right? From the early days of President George Washington, relying on these kind of consultative groups, these groups that are tackling some of these difficult questions and challenging these questions. I love to see it. I think that there's some really great information within these advisory committees, and one that's worth paying attention to. Remember that the National Shipper Advisory Committee is just the shipper side of things, though. Commissioner Dye has recommended in a few different ways, really, that the FMC should also have a Marine Terminal Operators and Ports Advisory Committee. We've really yet to see that created, but hopefully that's going to be a group that's not only established, but established in the near term, because I think that would provide a very full conversation. They obviously wouldn't, well, maybe they could all be under one advisory committee. But as it is now, the Shipper Advisory Committee, it would make sense to have a Marine Terminal Operators and Ports Advisory Committee, being the other area that the FMC regulates. They do have the VOCC audit teams. Perhaps maybe there would be a carriers advisory committee as well. I've kind of heard that mentioned, that the VOCC audit team. I don't know. We'll see. I would love to see stakeholder engagement wherever it is. I've talked about the notice and comment periods of rulemakings and that process, and how that's such a great way of the industry to engage with the Federal Maritime Commission or any federal agency directly. Advisory committees is another method, another platform, another mode of engaging with the federal agencies. I love it. I love it when the stakeholders are involved, because I think that then that makes the federal agency that much more effective. And it's important to get voices from many stakeholders in various different corners of the supply chain. Again, these meetings are public. Sometimes you have to register to receive the link. That's sometimes true with the National Shipper Advisory Committee. That's sometimes true with any other federal advisory committee out there. But it appears, at least for the National Shipper Advisory Committee, most of the meetings are recorded and then put out on the FMC's YouTube page. Go have a look. Pretty interesting stuff. Sometimes advisory committees fly below the radar. There's a lot of great information here and a lot of great conversations. So as always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice or directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you do have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Squall Strategies. Otherwise, for the non-legal questions, the e-learning and general industry information and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. If you like these videos, let me know, comment, like, and share. If you want to listen to these episodes on demand, or if you missed any previous episodes, check out the podcast By Land and by Sea. If you prefer to see the video, they live on my YouTube page, By Land and by Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. And while you're at it, check out the website, themaritimeprofessor.com. So until next week, this is Lauren Began, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and by Sea. And actually, next week is Thanksgiving, so we will not be doing a show next week. So I'll see you in December. All right. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you next time.